We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that you really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelming on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Doomberg, head writer for the Doomberg team and author of the Doomberg Substack. Doomberg, how are you today?
Tom, I'm doing great. Always a pleasure when I receive the invite to come back on your show and always enjoy our discussions.
Absolutely. Me too. You know, we cover so many different topics, and that's something that I really appreciate about being able to speak with you because, you know, as many shows as I do, it's not always easy to just, you know, cover gold, but obviously I have a lot more interests than just gold because a lot of this stuff, it all relates very well, I think. It's not just, you know, you can't just separate one thing and only look at that. So I was thinking we could kind of start today's discussion by talking about the news cycle around technological and scientific innovations and how many of these items that we talk about are, you know, touted as just being right around the corner. So what are some examples of innovations that have been touted as being months or a small number of years away, yet they've been that way for decades?
That's a great question. We've covered that topic in a variety of our articles, most recently in a piece called Solid State of Affairs. And I would directly answer your question by saying solid state batteries, fusion, pick your favorite, high room temperature superconductors, cures for cancer. These all feed into what we call the science hype cycle. And the science hype cycle is really an overlap in the Venn diagram between the media's need to drive clicks. You know, we live in a clickbait culture. The public's fascination with science, which is totally understandable. I mean, science and technology have done wonders to lift our standards of living and promise to continue to do so ad infinitum. And then the potential impact of certain inventions on society. The overlap in those three circles is where you'll find the science hype cycles. And solid state batteries in particular, as we said in the piece, we've been 3 years away from solid state batteries for the better part of 4 decades. The thing about batteries, and by the way, batteries are routinely hyped up as the solution for climate change because it will enable us to litter the landscape with wind turbines and solar panels, and we'll be able to store energy so that when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, our super batteries will be off of fossil fuels. At its core, the concept is nonsensical. But nonetheless, anytime somebody claims a big breakthrough in batteries, we see headline after headline after headline of the consequences of this great leap forward. Batteries are notoriously hard to improve. They are the opposite of susceptible to S-curve innovation or step change innovation. The ability to store an enormous amount of energy in a very small space is inherently dangerous. Recharging speeds are inherently anti-correlated with safety. The quicker you charge a battery, the more likely you are to cause a fire. Yes, things improve over time, but at a snail's pace. And finally, I would say we have a stone cold lead pipe deadlock rule in the chicken coop, which is there are no battery breakthroughs at startups. You could fade all of those. In my industrial career, I was on the receiving end of dozens and dozens of requests for proposals or requests for investment, I should say, in various startups, given my various roles in industry, all of them claiming huge breakthroughs in battery technology. And they just never really amount to anything. And you could save an enormous amount of time and money just by saying no to all of them, which is what I routinely recommend.
You know, on that topic of recharging times, does that also come at the cost of longevity sometimes for these batteries?
So if you think about what goes on inside a battery, it's basically a chemical reactor, right? You put energy in, chemistry changes inside the battery, that some of that energy is stored in the form that can be extracted later on. And of course, over time, with the number of cycles, batteries degrade. No battery lasts forever. But also the speed of charging does impact things. That's why trickle chargers are are desired, because when you do things fast, when you turn up the heat, side reactions happen. And even if a side reaction is 1 in 10 billion cycles, it eventually will overwhelm the system. And so, look, will there be solid state batteries that get commercialized? Sure. Will they be interesting and better than the incumbent battery technologies? Depends on how you measure. In absolute performance, sure. Optimized for price remains to be seen. But will such breakthroughs accelerate in a sort of a Moore's law fashion? The data is definitive. Batteries are a linear slog. They always have been. They always will be. And it takes big, giant companies with enormous resources to commercialize them because of the risks involved. People don't like to buy batteries from startups because they're not capitalized to fund a recall or to deal with a fire should they happen in a consumer product. The industry is so poorly understood, and analysis of it is so flippantly rudimentary that you'll see on Twitter or even in some publications that should know better. It truly is one of the core entrants in the science hype cycle.
Well, I had a discussion yesterday around Samsung, obviously not being a startup, building a solid state battery that will require 32 times the amount of silver that's currently being used in like the lithium ion batteries, for example. So does this warrant, caution, considering what we've just talked about, in building that into the demand picture for silver, for example?
I would say it merits extreme caution, and I would continue to focus on trends in the solar sector, were I to be modeling potential future supply demand scenarios for silver. I just think on a time frame that matters to the investment that you're probably holding today, solid state batteries are irrelevant. As we said in the piece, other incumbent technologies slowly but surely are developing and getting better. And already today in China, with traditional battery technology, you can get BYD is selling a plug-in hybrid car that on one full charge and one full tank of gasoline has 1,300 miles of range, 2,000 kilometers for your Canadian listeners of range. And in China, that car is selling for less than $14,000 US. How is solid state battery? Solid state batteries, if they are commercialized, we joked in the piece, it's always N+3. The latest target commercialization date is 2027. They're going to be very limited to ultra high-end full electric vehicles, the $150,000 supercars that you can buy today. And that's just not going to make a meaningful dent in silver. For solid state batteries to make a meaningful dent in silver. Other battery technologies may. I don't know how much silver is in various battery forms. But solid state in particular is not going to change the dial on silver anytime soon. In our view, look, we could be wrong.
So, that brings up a really interesting point. What do you think the difference between Western car manufacturers is and this BYD product that you mentioned? The let's say an average Tesla is over $100,000 and doesn't get nearly that range. Obviously, it uses a bit of a different system, but what do you see as the main difference for having an accessible, usable vehicle with a large range like that is more approachable for the average person instead of being priced out for most people?
So the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle technology we have long championed as the obvious bridging solution to the objective of lowering gasoline consumption in the transport sector. Having said that, of course, if we use less gasoline here, others will just use more gasoline there. But if you have you draw a box around Canada and you say you want to limit the amount of gasoline consumed in Canada, plug-in hybrids are far superior to battery electric vehicles across one critical dimension: the gallons of gasoline abated per kilogram of battery material. I'm trying to speak in metric for you. And I screwed it up because I said gallons. So liters of petrol divided by kilograms of battery materials. But to your broader question, China has stolen the automotive industry out from under the Western automakers, like they have done in every other industry. And we've written about this numerous times. To create Ford or to create GM, you had to invent a lot of tech. You spent an enormous amount of R&D to do that, and you competed against other automakers brutally over decades. Like anybody who works in industry knows that Western companies are routinely seduced by the mirage of growth in China, and they either voluntarily or involuntarily have their best intellectual assets ripped off, and then suddenly a competitor shows up leveraging cheaper labor and looser environmental laws, all things that are real costs for responsible Western manufacturers, and they just flood the market with supply and they put you out of business. They're going to do that, by the way, to the Western automakers. One of our overarching themes of the last year is the Western automakers are capitalized for global growth. And every country in the global south is going to look at that $14,000 BYD plug-in hybrid and say, I'm not going to pay 3 times as much for a GM or a Ford. And they're going to need to recapitalize, like as in file for bankruptcy. I've seen it. Like I personally was involved in the solar industry when China did the exact same playbook. I remember distinctly in the late 2000s seeing a BYD at a car show, and it was a literal ripoff of Toyota Corolla.
Sorry, Doomberg, I had a little interruption there in the internet. You said it was a literal ripoff of the Corolla.
100%. It was in a piece of ours that we wrote called Build Your Dreams. We showed the picture of it. It's indistinguishable from a Corolla. And we all laughed at it. It was like, oh, this is no big deal. This is, look at these, this car is falling apart. The handle comes off when you pull on it or whatever. But yeah, over time, if you take the very best of everybody else's technology, which they paid an enormous amount to develop, and you can just circumvent all those expenses, then yeah, your product's going to be cheaper. Don't forget. Also, the Western automakers, in the US at least, and Canada, have the United Auto Workers to deal with, and legacy pension issues and all of those things. And China doesn't have any of those things. So if you don't really care about intellectual property, worker rights, or environmental controls, you could produce a very cheap car and the rest of the world will buy it. And that's what they did in solar. That's what they did in batteries. That's what they did in rare earth metals. They don't mine very much in the way of rare earth metals, but they're willing to do the dirty work of processing them. So every kilogram of concentrate of rare earths has to go to China for processing. They have a literal monopoly on that critically important step. Guess what? That means every wind turbine box is filled with rare earth magnets that China ultimately controls. And for a stark example of how they will wield this weapon against us, just look at germanium and gallium. These are critical inputs into the semiconductor industry. We're trying our best to stop China from developing its own chip sector. And so they're just reducing exports and driving up the price of this critical input. They're strategic, and we should be strategic ourselves. We should understand what's going on. It's amazing to me that we have allowed Western companies to enter into these agreements with Chinese OEMs, government-owned companies. It's just, but that's the pieces on the board, and as analysts, we have to call it as we see it.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that that's, part of the issue for Western manufacturers, like example, Ford, to start questioning, if not stepping away from some of their EV lines?
Yeah, they're going to step away because the demand for them just isn't there. It was always artificial. I think a well-appointed, super fuel efficient, affordable plug-in hybrid vehicle is very attractive. Like I think that is the type of vehicle that demand will manifest for. But, an $80,000 vanity full battery electric so that you can, showboat to your neighbors that you care about the environment. It has a very small addressable market. And I believe it's almost certainly saturated at this point. All of those people have internal combustion extra car for when they want to go on long trips, right? I mean, not all, but I'm being a bit, exaggerating for effect. But the classical owner of a Tesla has, a mid-size SUV parked next to it in the garage for when they have to go visit family on the holidays.
Mm-hmm. So obviously with the goal of being more carbon neutral, how do most EVs, let's say most Western EVs, compare to an ICE vehicle just in terms of carbon needed to produce them?
So it's a difficult and hyper-political question to answer. There's the environmental footprint of the production of the batteries itself, which is debatable. For example, all the cobalt in the world comes from Congo, which has been credibly accused of running, child labor as a policy in these mines. They're some of the dirtiest mines in the world. Really sad what's going on there. And yet we all have, cobalt from the Congo in our iPhones, and we don't think twice about whipping them out to pay for our McDonald's, with the app. That's one question, like how energy intense are the creation of these batteries? That's an important and interesting one. Another question is, what is the resource intensity of the electricity that is going to be used to charge and recharge those batteries? And depending where you live, the carbon footprint of your electric vehicle is going to vary widely. If you live, you're getting most of your electricity from coal, for example. And then the last question is what happens at end of life, of course, because if you're going to do a full accounting of these batteries, if they can be recycled, and the energy needed to recycle them is manageable, then that bends the arc of the total equation. Clear cut that a BEV is net more beneficial than a good plug-in hybrid. I think I would say it's pretty strong evidence that plug-in hybrids on balance are better. Versus an ICE vehicle, of course, it's much easier to calculate, which is you just tally up there's energy that goes into making of the engine. There's a lot of metals in there and all of that stuff, but you just tally up the amount of gasoline that goes in it per mile, and you could predict the carbon footprint of that. It's a little more nuanced with the EV sector, and as I said, political, which means advocates of certain policies will tend to make very favorable assumptions either way. By the way, like pro or con, and it can be very difficult, especially for lay people, to cut through that noise.
Mm-hmm. As I was reading your piece about the science hype cycle, I often think about the idea that maybe you can be an environmentalist while still understanding that a lot of the current climate science has been more politicized and used more as a control system rather than, let's say, an objective way of looking at the world. Do you think carbon is possibly the wrong metric to be, so intently focused on?
If Doomberg were king, we would focus far more of society's attention on the need to control pollution and not just carbon emissions. There are real, tangible pollution problems that industry must deal with, driven by China and other Asian countries, by the way, it should be said. For example, the plastic crisis in the ocean is one, real, two, almost exclusively caused by China and their neighbors, and three, almost no plastic consumed in the West ends up in the ocean. We know how to handle and recycle disposable goods, disposable consumer goods, packaging, milk jugs, pick your favorite. There's lots of things we could do with them. We know how to do it. And yet we focus on replacing your Corolla or your Prius with a Tesla as though this is going to meaningfully impact the arc of the environment. Mm-hmm. So we would, at the highest level, be focused more heavily on pollution. And in fact, China uses this. We wrote a piece called Geopolitical Warfare, where we made mention of the fact that Chinese has looser environmental standards necessarily means that Western competitors are put out of business. And this is why, for example, the US produces no magnesium today. And China has a stranglehold on that market. Magnesium is a critical input into aluminum composites, which are critical to the automotive industry and to lightweighting and to abating carbon emissions. Now, as it pertains to climate change, our view is that nonlinear systems are really difficult to predict and even more difficult to control, and that our limited resource budget is probably better spent on waiting for and reacting to any meaningful negative consequences to climate change, as opposed to preemptively spending money in an effort to prevent them. So a perfect example is the water levels in the Colorado River, which we recently wrote about in a piece called Leaving Las Vegas. It turns out that the cost to abate shrinking water levels along the Colorado and give the dams along that river a chance to rebuild the water stores behind them was amazingly cheap. It was like $1.2 billion for 3 million acre feet of water. That's a fraction of a penny per liter, a small fraction of a penny per liter. And bribing the lower basin states, California, Arizona, Nevada, with a $1.2 billion payment resulted in some relief to the system. And this whole topic of abatement versus preemption, adaptation versus preemption, is kind of taboo in the environmental world. Like, you're not supposed to talk about that. Rolling the dice, is not considered wise. The primary reason why they say that adaptation should be off limits is because only rich countries can afford to adapt, and that will leave the poor countries to feel the brunt of climate change. Well, those same poor countries are burning every single molecule of coal, natural gas, and oil they can get their hands on to climb up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And in fact, as we said in the piece, non-OECD countries are responsible for more than 100% of the growth in carbon emissions in the past 20 years. What does that mean? It means the OECD countries, the US, Canada, pick your favorite Western country, they're shrinking their carbon emissions, substituting natural gas for coal, and getting more efficient in their vehicle fleets and so on. We're shrinking our carbon emissions, and China in particular is just soaring in their emissions. Peace and development now, where we're talking about New Zealand and New Zealand's energy crisis. China's growth in carbon emissions in 2023 over 2022 was the equivalent of 22 New Zealands and their carbon emissions. Just their growth in 1 year. And we have New Zealand, impaling itself at the altar of the Church of Carbon in some meaningless sacrifice. It's absurd to focus exclusively on carbon emissions as it pertains to environmental policy when we have real pollution issues to consider. We have real adaptation policies in reserve, and putting aside some funds to implement those adaptation policies seems rather prudent, much more prudent than wasting trillions of dollars in a fruitless effort to try to prevent it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I always come back to the idea that maybe we should be focused on using the power and the energy that we have more efficiently, rather than just being outright focused on switching everything completely. One of my favorite examples is just thinking about how Christmas lights, let's say the life cycle of Christmas lights, how much it actually takes to produce them, how much it actually takes to power them, and where they end up when people are done with them. I mean, this is an example of something that is, just for aesthetics, that I would love to actually understand the materials impact, the pollution impact, the energy impact of everything that goes into that one particular item.
So you're opening up a bit of an interesting discussion. So let me give you a couple of examples. What's the carbon footprint of the Super Bowl? With preseason games, regular season games, people flying all over the country, teams flying all over the country, driving to and from the stadium, all of the food and the beer and the electricity to power the televisions and all of the televisions around the world that are tuned into it. It's enormous, right? Mm-hmm. What's the carbon footprint of watering your lawns? I mean, water is basically a derivative of energy, but we all like to drive in neighborhoods that are freshly cut green lawns. It feels like civilized and wealthy, I suppose. So you're actually getting to the core of energy is life. And your standard of living is defined by how much energy you get to waste. It's nice to celebrate Christmas with your community, especially if you're Christian, and to see people get pride of ownership in a sense. Like if you're putting nice Christmas decorations up on your house and you live in a nice neighborhood, that's pride of ownership. That's just part of living. That's the culture. That's life. Energy is life. How much energy you get to waste is literally the definition of your standard of living. Now, to your opening part of that question, energy efficiency is an interesting topic. So, in absolute, increases in energy efficiency are always good, should be applauded. However, increases in energy efficiency invariably lead to increased energy consumption. This is a well-known phenomenon known as Jevons paradox. I'll give you the classic example of the Jevons paradox, which is the invention of the steam engine made the mining of coal far more efficient. We didn't just mine the same amount of coal we were using more cheaply. Mm-hmm. the amount of coal we burned skyrocketed because it became easier to get. And so efficiency inevitably leads to more consumption, not less. And so having energy efficiency as a plank in your climate change solution strategy is inherently flawed. It should be pursued. It should be applauded. It should not be parroted as a means to lower the globe's net energy consumption.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. Because of the second order effect or the derivative effect of becoming more efficient.
Yeah, look, if you make something cheaper, demand goes up. And so it's very close to what we've sort of formalized as Doomberg's postulate, which states that every molecule of fossil fuels produced in the world will be burned by somebody somewhere, and local restrictions against such activities merely change who gets the benefit of the privilege of doing so. And so if we become more fuel efficient and the world still produces the same amount of gasoline, guess what? Gasoline gets cheaper, and people in Indonesia are going to burn it, and people in India are going to burn it, and people in Pakistan are going to burn it, and people in Bangladesh are going to burn it. And who are we to tell them they can't? But they will. We're going to put out a pro tier talk here today, actually, later after we're done recording this, called The Year of the Dragon, China Through the Lens of Energy. And in that analysis, we showed that if the Chinese energy use per capita were to suddenly jump up to the same as the US, all things being equal, the world would need 36% more energy.
Wow.
It's stunning. And by the way, they're going to. They're not going to stop developing. India is not going to stop developing.
Everybody wants that same standard of living that the US has.
Of course. And who are we to tell them they can't?
So, Doomberg, what do you think we should be more focused on in terms of, let's say, grid and the ideas to make, let's say, Western systems more reliable? Should we be focused on, making more transformers, upgrading the grid, or should the transition to these greener energy production systems be part of that focus as well?
I think wind and solar, wind in particular, have very little utility as it pertains to running an electricity grid with any semblance of reliability. There are certain locations where solar can make sense, and those locations tend to be regularly sunny and hot and dry, like Nevada, where the sun's intensity and the demands of electricity are strongly correlated, i.e. air conditioning. It makes no sense in Canada or Maine or Germany or the UK or Michigan, or pick your favorite northern, because electricity actually, where you need nighttime heating, it's literally out of complete rhythm with the solar cycle. In other words, you need more electricity at night when the sun doesn't shine, because at night it's cold, and heating is more important than cooling in the northern parts of our climates. But mostly we could do without any of it. I think nuclear and existing hydro that we have, and so on. Nuclear and natural gas can cover everything we need in our view, and cheaply, especially here. I mean, God, we wrote this piece about the Western energy provinces of Canada called After Trudeau, which can't come soon enough, by the way. We are swimming in natural gas in North. The resource base of natural gas in the US and in Canada should be modeled as effectively infinite for the next 30 years, 3 decades, at least. The only gating function of natural gas production in these two countries is politics, Ottawa and Washington. If we open the spigots, we could produce an infinite amount of natural gas. Natural gas is so cheap right now that it's selling for about $10 a barrel oil on an energy content basis, both in Alberta, British Columbia, Texas. We're an energy gigapower. So if we just took, in my ideal world, the US would just take the CANDU reactor technology and spread it all over the country. It's a great system, well-known technology. We have friends to the north that have a deep understanding of how to safely build and operate these facilities. We make a one-time investment. quadruple our nuclear energy use, continue to substitute coal for natural gas, and be done with it.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you bring up this idea of politicians and politics being the gating function to this form of energy production. One of the questions that I wanted to save for a bit later, but it fits perfectly here, is this idea of the differences in the outcome of the election of Democrat versus Republican. One of the pieces that I've been thinking a lot about was this stat that under Biden we've produced more gas than anybody else, and that is really antithetical, or that idea is really antithetical to the notion that they really hate the oil and gas sector. So, how do you see this difference going forward of a Republican win versus a Democratic win?
So it's a very nuanced answer. So and Biden deserves little in the way of credit for the fact that the U.S. is producing more oil and natural gas than it ever has, or any country ever on Earth has ever produced. The idiosyncrasies of U.S. energy policy are such that so long as molecules or electrons don't cross state borders or international borders, it is in the state's purview to regulate their energy industries. And so, yes, if you have a pipeline that crosses state lines, then you need federal approval for things. But by and large, most of the things that happen in Texas are regulated by Texas, and most of the things that happen in Louisiana are regulated by Louisiana. And this is why California, which has arguably just as rich a resource base as Texas, Texas is a world energy gigapower, and California is a flaccid energy vassal. These are political choices at the state level. Mm-hmm. Now, we have a counterintuitive view of what happens if Trump wins or if Harris wins. Under Democratic regimes, production is lower than it would otherwise be at the margin, and therefore energy companies make a ton more money. And even though the sort of caricature of a Texas oil executive is a conservative one, they make an enormous amount of money during Democratic regimes because they will drill themselves into bankruptcy if left to their own devices. Mm-hmm. And a Trump win would be great for energy supply and terrible for energy equities because they will just drill themselves into oblivion. They have an infinite capacity to incinerate shareholder capital. They've proven it time and time again, and they have precious little in the way of discipline. And so it is ironically very bullish for Exxon's equity if Harris wins, mm-hmm. and bearish if Trump does, in our view.
Mm-hmm. And the inverse for actual, as you said, energy supply. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Which, by the way, people think we're like bullish energy. We're bullish energy supply. Mm-hmm. Like, again, if we had unfettered access to responsible development of these resources, oil would be $20 a barrel. I mean, very quickly, just as cheap as natural gas. Look, and by the way, these companies are technical wizards, right? I mean, the cost to produce 1 million BTU in Appalachia is something like $2.25 per million BTU. It's dirt cheap. Multiply that by 5.6 and get the price. So like they learn, the technology keeps, and we just saw this Chevron announcement about 20,000 PSI well under the sea, and these amazing technological breakthroughs that will spread all over the world over time. We're never going to run out of oil and gas, and these companies are never going to stop getting better. And it's indistinguishable from magic what these companies do. It would blow people's minds if they could see it. I mean, and so we have this. We should be grateful to these companies. They're price takers and they're growth oriented, and nothing gets an oil executive more excited than growth, right? When they should be focused on price, of course, and because these materials are inelastic, it doesn't take much in the way of a shortage for price to skyrocket, and that's when they make all their money. There would be no shortages if there were no regulatory embodiments and impediments, and these regulatory impediments are deeply bullish for equities and deeply bearish for supply.
Mm-hmm. And of course, in our previous conversation, I think in February, you and I went through a lot of that idea of this peak oil and gas, so people can check that out if they want to know more about that. But I completely understand your point about this orthogonal way, or this better way of thinking about the actual consequences of what happens in these in these different political environments.
Yeah, look, if you're free to drill, they'll drill.
Mhm.
And if you are not allowed to drill, prices will go up.
Mhm.
And energy companies make money on price, not volume, always.
Mhm. So what actual new tech is there in let's say the power generation space that makes you hopeful?
So electricity generation per se, I mean, I think we've done a pretty interesting analysis of the potential for natural or geologic hydrogen. I think that could be a real game changer. We wrote a piece, I believe it was called "In Search of the Next Shale," and this is pretty interesting. For many decades, scientists assumed that natural formations of hydrogen could not did not exist underground, mostly because all of the oil and gas drillers never really encountered them. But they do exist. They tend to exist as a result of contact between water and iron-rich deposits, which sort of undergoes a form of rusting, which generates hydrogen in the process. And then there are certain formations that can trap that hydrogen for future development. And I think technology is progressing relatively fast there. And that's one to keep an eye on. And again, it's hard to predict. You know, back in the late 2000s, many of the same critics of ours in the current cheap oil debate were loudly proclaiming that natural gas in Appalachia would never be economic. You know, the Marcellus Shale would never amount to anything, and all of these companies are foolish for investing in this area. And that's still out there on the internet. You can go search for it. It's really remarkable, actually, how vitriolic they were in their opposition to the prospect of shale gas amounting to much. And yet, the Marcellus Shale is like 1.5 times the size of Qatar. It's the most prolific natural gas field that humanity has ever discovered. It's just obscene the amount of natural gas coming out of there, and it's only been gated by lack of pipeline infrastructure to offtake the stuff. Same thing in the Permian. We're producing so much natural gas in the Permian that often trades for negative prices. So predicting the arc of technical breakthroughs is challenging. And we're not ready to say that geologic hydrogen will be as consequential as shale. Mm-hmm. But the scales involved and the speed with which this technology is being developed are consistent with the types of ingredients you would need to bake a cake the size of shale. And so that's one of the things on our radar that we're paying very close attention to.
Do you think fusion reactors fit into the category of tech that is promised to be right around the corner, yet not being able to be reached as well?
Sure, and utterly unnecessary to boot. We've solved the energy problem. Fission works just fine. Fusion is an unnecessary distraction from fission. Here's why. The problems fusion purports to solve are utterly contrived. So the two main reasons why people are excited about fusion are doesn't generate waste in the way that fission does, and has no meltdown risk in the way that fission allegedly does. Neither of those are real problems. Both of those are utterly solvable for far less investment than it would take to continue to research fusion and get it off the ground. Mm-hmm. Nuclear waste, quote unquote, is literally nothing more than a gift to future generations of engineers. All of those waste products could be fed through fast breeder reactors and to fuel easily. We don't do it because of nuclear proliferation fears, which are real and need to be addressed. Mm-hmm. But nuclear waste and reactor meltdown risk are literally vanishingly tiny risks that pale in comparison to the trade-offs of burning coal or natural gas or even installing wind and solar at great expense and damage to the environment. Like, we've solved the problem. It's called fission. And you could rest assured that in the very unlikely event that fusion achieves a real breakthrough that suddenly makes the technology economically viable, the same environmentalists who are opposing fission will line up and invent all kinds of reasons to oppose fusion. That this is like Lucy with the football. Just when you're ready to kick it, they're going to pull it away anyway. So I think all money spent on fusion is wasted. I think this is a classic example of the science hype cycle. Trying to solve fake problems for all the wrong reasons is nothing to get excited about.
Mm-hmm. How about small modular reactor tech and thorium reactors? Is this another area that we should be, focused on and being able to really innovate in that space?
Thorium reactors, again, don't really get me excited because it solves a fake problem. We're never going to run out of uranium. There's plenty of it. Standard reactor designs work well enough, leave well enough alone. SMRs are a bit more nuanced. The opportunity for small modular reactors does open up the prospect of abating carbon emissions from industrial heat in a way that large modular reactors might not. And so you could envision installing small modular reactors inside the fence line of existing heavy industry, where you could then co-create heat, steam, and electricity like natural gas does today in what are known as cogeneration facilities. And that's a prospect that is meaningful. Look, 10% of the world's energy goes towards making steam for industrial use. And the latest reactor designs, which aren't necessarily because they're small, but just the nature of their designs, allow for the production of sufficiently high temperature steam to be useful in many, but not all, industrial applications. And so that's something that we think is interesting to pursue. But large modular fission reactors with known designs and predictable supply chains are the way to go. And anything that distracts from that is net negative.
You know, you brought up this idea of the nuclear proliferation. And I think it was a recent podcast with Peter Thiel. And he was talking about much of the political resistance against nuclear was because of, countries being able to also make weapons when they have nuclear fuel capabilities. So is this another, piece of that puzzle to understand about how the nuclear picture has evolved over time?
So it is real, and I think manageable. Look, a country that is hell-bent on developing nuclear weapons is going to be very difficult to stop. Mm-hmm. I don't think building out reactors in Germany is going to accelerate Iran's pursuit of the bomb or North Korea's pursuit of the bomb. They're going to do those things anyway. Mm-hmm. It's important that we do everything in our power to try to stop them. This is effectively nothing to do with civilian nuclear energy. Nuclear weapons and civilian nuclear energy are two wholly different things, but the environmentalists who oppose nuclear energy routinely conflate them. I think we have systems in place to measure and control the nuclear materials within the framework of countries that are responsible and care about following the rules. The tightness of those rules will not stop bad actors hell-bent on developing their own nuclear technology. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a bit of a false choice. We can have nuclear reactor technology in Canada and in the US and in the UK and France, but whether or not we pursue those strategies is not going to bend the arc of North Korea's activities. And so I don't think the former should be blamed for the latter.
On this idea of kind of keeping countries controlled, are the West's tools like sanctions and confiscating reserves effective at controlling Russia and putting pressure on them? We're 2.5 years into that Ukraine conflict, and it doesn't seem like there's, at this point, any end in sight.
We've made them stronger. Sanctions backfired. And we like to say, the best proof that something was predictable is to have predicted it. Within weeks of the rollout of the energy sanctions in particular, we raised a cautionary warning that this was not only going to fail, but likely backfire. Mm-hmm. Again, back to the whole price sensitivity of commodities. By taxing Russia's volume, we allowed them to more than make it up in price. And the world has rewired its energy arteries because the world needed Russia's energy. The proper way to have quote unquote sanctioned Russia was to outproduce them, to flood the world with commodities and to crash the price of oil below Russia's marginal cost to produce. That's how you hit Putin's profits, not by making it slightly harder for his oil to get to the market, which only makes oil measurably higher than it would have otherwise been in price. Mm-hmm. They are running circles around us intellectually in this war. And it's frustrating to see because it was plainly obvious to anybody who had spent 5 minutes in industry that nobody who had spent any time in industry was making this policy. Mm-hmm. It's insane. It's almost designed to backfire. And it certainly did.
So obviously this is, has lots of effects within the energy industry, but, is this something that you see continuing even after, let's say, we get an end to this conflict?
Well, I think depending on how the conflict ends, I mean, I'm very nervous about the conflict ending in utter defeat of NATO. I think that's the base case now. Any objective observer of especially the recent running of the tables in the Donbass that Russia is executing while the rest of the world is celebrating Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. I don't know how NATO will handle defeat, and I think that's very risky. Mm-hmm. But I think they're staring defeat. I think everybody knows that defeat is coming. And again, back to our whole discussion about proliferation, like we've tried to argue, well, one of the reasons why you don't get into wars with, what's the primary reason why we don't want countries to get nuclear weapons? Because once they get them, you have to treat them differently. Russia is the world's largest nuclear superpower. It has a larger and more sophisticated nuclear weapons arsenal than even the US. Mm-hmm. What are we doing? What are we actually doing here? Like, what is the end goal? The kinetic defeat and occupation of Russia? Like, what do we think we're going to win back Crimea from Russia? Like, kinetically with traditional arms? Of course not. And even if we were to get close to doing so, they'll just use their nuclear weapons. I mean, why do they have nuclear weapons? For this very purpose. We wouldn't be putting up with it on our border. Mm-hmm. I'm not defending what's going on. I'm just doing an objective analysis. Like, we're going to lose that war. Like, I think it's pretty clear. We after 2.5 years, and by the way, the biggest losers in all this are the Ukrainians. I saw a report where using cellular data, it looks like half the population is no longer there. How many hundreds of thousands of young men have been sacrificed in this adventure? Mm-hmm. By the way, just in the last few days, I think an illegal act of war to target Ukrainians' electricity infrastructure deliberately, but they've been doing it, and they had a massive missile strike that is going to put much of the Ukrainian population in the dark in the winter. And that's not going to be a very pleasant place to be come December and January. Again, I want to say it's the activity of doing that is dastardly and probably a war crime. I don't want anybody to assume that trying to understand what's actually going on is somehow apologizing for Putin, because we're not. But the Ukrainian energy infrastructure has been destroyed. This is going to crimp Ukraine's ability to equip its soldiers and feed its soldiers, let alone its population. Mm-hmm. And we're running out of resources to help support them from afar. I mean, we were never going to win a supply chain war on Russia's border from thousands of miles away. By the way, that supply chain utterly dependent on China, who has sided with Russia in this war. Like, I don't understand what we're doing. I really don't. It's been puzzling from the beginning. At least in the beginning, we could focus on the energy side of it because we understood it. But then it occurred to us that the same people who rolled out this ridiculous energy sanction strategy are the same ones executing the military strategy of the war. And why should we give them any credit on that side of it just because we don't know as much about it? The more we look at it, the more we see the same lack of fundamental understanding. Russia is used to grinding out wars from east to west. It's not their first rodeo. And I think so. It's frustrating. It's sad. It's very, very tragic for the people of Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And really one of the saddest episodes of the past 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, with this seemingly, ever-growing conflict, does this bode well for gold as a neutral reserve asset?
I think the bifurcation of the world into G7 and BRICS, to be sort of blunt, is real, has been accelerated. It predates the war in Ukraine, but it has certainly been accelerated by our behavior during the war in Ukraine. And I think a defeat of NATO might accelerate it even more. And I'm full to the gills with gold. I own as much gold as I ever have. It's not investment advice. Probably marks a top. I'm starting to see the price of gold being mentioned in news sites and periodicals that normally wouldn't, which is gives me some caution about the sort of forward price action of gold in the immediate or short term. But I don't own the gold that I own as an investment. I own it as a means of saving. Mm-hmm. I earn in fiat, I save in real assets, and then I invest privately. That is the way that I run my own personal portfolio. And so the amount of gold I own is just testimony to the amount of savings I'd like to have right now, as opposed to how much I want invested. But I'm not unbiased in my analysis of the price of gold because I own a lot of it. But I think the the 100-year trend of gold is it will protect your purchasing power of today. And I would like to protect my purchasing power of today, and that's why I own a lot of gold. The dollar price of gold will fluctuate wildly. Sometimes it'll go down, sometimes it'll go up. Gold is the one asset in my portfolio that I own that I don't get excited about when it goes up, because it usually means something else is wrong in the rest of my portfolio. I like to tell my children that 20 gold eagles will buy you a nicely appointed mid-size SUV today, and it'll buy you a nicely appointed mid-size SUV in 40 years. And that's the role gold should play in your portfolio. The security price of PHYS is not super meaningful to me. Preserving the purchasing power from the hard work that I've been able to get done in my life is more important. And that's the role that I mentally allocate to gold and land and other collectibles where I save, as opposed to just putting it in a bank and having it, wither away to the forces of inflation.
Well, this idea, going back to the, let's say, Russia-Ukraine conflict and how much money the US has sent over there. If we think about, let's say, the role of the USD in the world versus, let's say, the rise of the BRICS as a power, do you think that the reality of the rise of the BRICS is something that falls in that category of having, being a little bit more sensationalized than it otherwise would have been?
One small correction. We didn't send money over there. We sent weapons over there. The money stayed here. The money just went from the U.S. Treasury to the pockets of the military-industrial complex, who are now turning around and reinvesting the record profits they've been making as a consequence of this war into various share buybacks, which is a scandal. So that's actually what happened with the money. We wrote in a piece called Occipital Region about the JFK assassination that when you're in the bomb-making business, peace is a working capital problem, right? And so the money is still here. It just went from the U.S. Treasury to Boeing and Lockheed. So
I thought there were examples. Sorry to interrupt. I thought there were examples of
Sure.
Ukrainian officials that.
Sure. We're paying their pensions and their paychecks and all that, but the real, the bulk of the money is in the weapons.
Okay. Yeah.
And of course, yes, we're propping them up, keeping the remnants of Ukraine's economy going. But the real driving factor is just this gravy train of money from Washington to the pockets of the military industrial complex. I think that's just undeniable. So to your question about the exaggerated effect of the BRICS, no, I think it's real. I think the world is bifurcating. I think 7 billion people are going to be on the side of BRICS and 1 billion people will be on the side of the West. And that's going to be the multipolar world that comes out of this conflict, assuming we don't nuke each other.
Well, I think on that happy note, Doomberg, I think that's all I really have for you today. Is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with to think about or to consider before we do wrap up?
No, I think that we should have a serious conversation about how and when we decide to go to war. I think, especially here in the Western world, in North America in particular, we should look inward for a while. The rest of the world can handle its own affairs, and we've got a lot of problems to work on at home. Keep a close eye on the U.S. elections in November, sort of an event horizon, a singularity past which the laws of economics may break down. So who knows how that's going to turn out. So lots of things to keep an eye on in the world. Tom, it's always great to talk with you. I really enjoyed it. You can find all of our work at doomberg.com, but your listeners probably already know that.
Absolutely. I always appreciate getting to speak with you and really trying to stretch my thinking and consider these second order and derivative effects of many of these different pieces of the puzzle that I think we're all trying to get a handle on. So I really appreciate our conversation as well. Again, like you said, doomberg.com for anybody that wants more of their material. You guys do a ton of excellent writing on a lot of different topics, not just energy. And I think it's an important read.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom, and I appreciate it. And looking forward to the next one.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doomberg.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.